Today, we are very lucky to have Professor Jose Alvarez, my colleague at NYU Law School, and my good friend and sometime co-author, Shitong from Hong Kong University, to talk about COVID's challenges, the WHO and COVID's challenges in China and throughout the world. And I'm not going to waste any time saying anything more about their extraordinary resumes, except to say that I'm very glad to be here, and we're very lucky to have both of them. So without further ado, I will just ask my colleague, Jose.
Thank you, Rick. So it's a pleasure to be here for the first of 3 talks in the USALI series on COVID's challenges. So this talk, mine in any case, is really focusing on 2 things: the institutional challenges and needed reforms to the World Health Organization in the age of COVID, and how the current leadership of 2 leading actors, the US and China, makes it difficult to undertake the needed reforms. My argument is that the organization that was designed to prevent pandemics, the World Health Organization, now facing 40 million infected, over 1 million dead, failed in its core task. No less than the League of Nations failed in preventing World War II. But I don't see the world doing what it did with the League of Nations. I don't see it replacing the WHO, not in the era of quite a strong resistance to multilateral institutions generally. And that is not necessarily a bad thing, because I think the premises and the goals of the WHO have proven right in the age of COVID. The World Health Organization does not need replacing, it needs reform, deep reform. But unless Trump is voted out of office next week, I don't see the US doing much to improve the WHO's capacity to deal with COVID or future pandemics. And unless China's leadership dramatically changes its mind about what sovereignty means, I don't see it pushing for the most needed WHO reforms, despite China's win-win rhetoric in favor of multilateral cooperation. It's important to be clear-eyed about the WHO's flaws if we want to fix them. Those who established the organization at the end of World War II got a lot of things right. The realities of COVID validate the premises of the Constitution of the WHO, that global health is not a zero-sum game. That is, the failure of one state to prevent the spread of disease presents a common danger to all, and all states benefit when each protects the health of its own population. The many unknowns about the current virus substantiate the World Health Organization's constitution, its emphasis on states' duty to cooperate. We need the joint coordinated efforts of the world's best experts, each informed of each other's latest findings in real time. The WHO is essential to achieve consensus on strategic direction, to leverage the relative strengths of nations, to respond to diverse stakeholders, and to nurture scientific cooperation among rival institutions. We need to continue under the WHO's R&D strategy, which gathers all the relevant information on the virus to provide sound advice on diagnostics, control measures, ameliorative treatments, and possible vaccines. That is essential. The WHO tells us the latest findings, exposes critical knowledge gaps, sets up research priorities, and ensures that science and research stays at the heart of the response. We need the WHO's roadmap to set the global agenda to control COVID and set a sustainable baseline to address future outbreaks. The pandemic's effects on international regimes, quite apart from those that deal with global health, its effects on global supply chains, on services and capital flows, on some 21 human rights treaties, all of these suggest why the WHO's constitution, which was once called the Magna Carta for Health, was right to demand that states have medical core capacities inside them, internally, and not just the capacity to screen for disease at their borders or airports. Now that it's clear how a virus can wreak economic havoc everywhere, can dramatically affect the rights of the most vulnerable, from indigenous tribes to the aged in nursing homes, to those in prisons, the World Health Constitution, its claim that the provision of health is an essential public good, looks now like realpolitik and not some utopian fantasy. and the knock-on effects of COVID on economic inequality, structural racism, xenophobia, rates of chronic disease that are left untreated because of the pandemic, increase in instances of child and spousal abuse. It seems obvious that the World Health Constitution was not wrong to proclaim back in 1946, if you can believe this, that the right to health is indeed a fundamental right that all governments have an obligation to fulfill. It seems to have preceded Barney Sanders' discovery of that fact. It would also be wrong to blame only WHO for current failures. There is certainly enough blame to go around. States, especially my own, are responsible for failing to do what the WHO's international health regs, the IHRs, demand. Many states fail to establish the core medical and health capacities that are needed to detect and prevent the spread of disease. Many states, prominently the US, failed to act in accordance with WHO's recommendations for widespread testing, contact tracing, and isolation. Other states have gone the other way and overreacted. They have not implemented measures with, quote, the full respect for the dignity, human rights, and fundamental freedoms of persons that is required under the IHR's Article 3.1. Their quarantines, lockdowns have not always respected principles of necessity and proportionality, or have actually encouraged racist and xenophobic actions such as discrimination against those of Asian descent. States have generally resisted the multilateral cooperation that is demanded by the WHO, have struck out on their own with dramatically uneven consequences. For every success story of Vietnam, South Korea, or Taiwan, and perhaps to a considerable extent Singapore, we have a failure, the US, the UK, Brazil. And successes and failures do not necessarily correspond to old narratives about successful rich democracies versus poor authoritarian regimes. But the WHO needs to answer charges that are quite apart and separate in a way from all of those. It has failed as an organization to live up to the promise of its constitution. It failed when, despite its authority to seek information from many different sources, it did not challenge information initially received from China about the first appearance of the virus, even in the face of contrary information from medical experts in Taiwan. It failed when it was overly deferential to the Chinese government's subsequent assurances that there was no evidence of human-to-human transmission until late January, or when it failed to secure the genetic sequence of the virus before it was posted online by a researcher at Fudan and only then later acknowledged by the Chinese government. Public health experts argue that the sheer opacity of the Chinese response in those early days sowed diplomatic mistrust at a critical time. The WHO did not challenge the Chinese lack of candor. Many experts conclude that the consequent delay in securing information contributed to the early spread of the disease domestically in China and internationally. A study published in Nature estimated that had China acted just a week earlier, it would have reduced China's own caseload by 66%. If it had acted 3 weeks earlier, it could have cut cases 95%. Instead, from early December through January 23rd, millions of people traveled to and from the city of Wuhan, including thousands who carried the virus all over the world undetected. Now, China has tried to redeem itself since then by sending medical teams, aid, and loans. It has done a remarkable job of controlling the virus within its borders, and the numbers speak for themselves. Despite China's far vaster population, it has recorded less than 90,000 cases of the virus compared to the US's 8 million, has had 5,000 deaths approximately, as compared to over 220,000 for the United States. And indeed, just a couple of weeks ago, when China found 12 new cases in one city, it administered 10 million COVID tests within 5 days. Authorities in the US and in Europe are incapable of such action. But the suspicions aroused by China's early actions have not wholly died down. Consider China's decision over the past couple of weeks to join the Kovacs Vaccine Alliance, a cooperative venture in which participating countries share certain vaccines as they become available. Under Kovacs, richer countries share any emerging vaccines corresponding to their financial contributions, and 92 low-income countries get assurance of the vaccines based on need and vulnerability. Kovacs combats the evils of vaccine nationalism, namely the effort by countries like the United States to strike their own deals with pharmaceutical companies to secure the vaccines only for their own citizens. One would have thought that by joining Kovacs and generally contributing to its success, China would have generated unvarnished praise. But instead, because of China's prior actions and its overly crude diplomatic efforts since, some have argued that China joined Kovacs just to assure a global market for its own vaccines. Now, turning to the WHO, it made, in my view, 4 critical errors in responding to COVID. It was too late in declaring a public health emergency of international concern, a PHEIC. It has issued inflexible and contradictory policy advice on everything from mask wearing to social distancing to the extent of aerial transmission and what to do about any of those things. It has been insufficiently transparent as with respect to whom it consulted when declaring the PHEIC, and it has been unwilling to criticize major funders' failures to comply with its own rules, whether it's China at the outset or through the present day, the United States. Now, none of this justifies the decision taken by President Trump to defund the WHO, give notice that it intends to withdraw from the organization. That decision by our termination man, who seems to do the same with lots of other things, is yet another stupid effort to deflect blame from Trump's own failures and pin it on the WHO, or as he calls it, the China virus. In the US, at least, if we have to call it something other than COVID-19, I would suggest that it's quite plausible to call it the Trump virus. Trump is not wrong that the WHO has a checkered history with respect to handling of pandemics, as does the US itself, frankly. But what ails the WHO is not its prescient vision of a multifaceted right to health. What ails it is best understood in terms of the top reasons that many organizations, including UN system organizations, are today in crisis. First, like other UN system organizations, the WTO is too state-centric. It relies on states to tell the truth, when the truth is likely to hurt a state's economy and reputation. This state-centric organization cannot directly involve non-state actors, like airlines, for instance, in its governance, even when those actors can undermine the WHO's public health recommendations. The WHO stays at some distance from the clinicians who connect through back channels on social media and communicate urgent findings to their colleagues. It does not talk directly to the ophthalmologist in Wuhan, for example, or the intensive care specialist in Bergamo, Italy, both sounding the first alarms. The WHO lacks a direct connection to healthcare professionals on the front lines, who frequently are the first to act because they have an ethical duty to do so and not politically compromised. The WHO does not engage frontline providers in epidemiologic surveillance. For that reason, some people propose a Committee C within the Health Assembly composed of diverse non-state actors to increase the organization's transparency, its coordination, and engagement with those actors. Second, the organization overly relies on soft law techniques. Like other technocratic UN system organizations, it relies on its own legitimacy and the presumed self-interest of states to secure compliance. It seeks to persuade, not coerce, and it does so through soft managerial techniques. It's not empowered to name and shame states unwilling to tell the truth. It cannot aggressively inquire about states' actual medical capacities. It cannot punish states that silence whistleblowers or that use the excuse of pandemic to advance political agendas. There is no effective mechanism for accountability within the organization, and even soft persuasion doesn't work without money. There is no dedicated funding for states that are willing to comply but cannot. Third, inflexible, non-transparent emergency declarations. The organization's 6 proclamations of public health emergencies have been generally subject to Goldilocks criticisms. They're either too late or too soon, rarely just right. While the proclamation on COVID was criticized for coming too late, in other cases, the proclamations have been seen as premature. They have also drawn criticisms for lack of transparency. It's unclear which experts were consulted and based on what evidence. Its PHEICs are problematic also because they are binary. It's an on-off switch. The harsh effects on a state that is subject to such a proclamation makes it less likely that states will report emerging health threats accurately within the 24 hours that are required by the IHRs. And the WHO's own experts have suggested that a less binary system of alerts, a traffic light system, permitting a more gradual transition as the pathogen becomes more serious, is perhaps better than this on-off switch. There's also need for clearer criteria for particular alerts, along with procedural changes that increase transparency, participation. All of these would help dispel the mystery of why a public health emergency exists and perhaps increase public support for them and the subsequent advice provided by the organization. Fourth, there's an absence of cross-regime institutionalized mechanisms for collaboration. That is, as we learned with COVID has implications for peace and security, for finance, for trade, for investment, for international civil aviation, for the law of the sea, for regional and global human rights, for international humanitarian law, and for the environment. But there's no established mechanism for coordinating among such regimes. And for that reason, some people have proposed a global health security coordinator at the UN that, for example, could trigger the Security Council's actions under Chapter 7 to actually force states to comply with the WHO's edicts, establish medical peacekeeping missions, as the Security Council did with respect to Ebola, or require inter-regime collaboration so that, for example, financial assistance by the World Bank goes directly to the particular regions or countries. And finally, the hazards of expertise and other organizational pathologies. It's a good thing that the World Health Organization is made up of public health experts, but as everybody knows, when that expert becomes a bureaucrat, expert-driven blind spots emerge. And so the organization is too rare to go outside its comfort zone, to involve anthropologists, psychologists, political scientists. There's a lagging concern for putting that expertise to work. If the organization had put human rights, which are in the IHRs, more central, then we would have a more closer scrutiny of the wisdom of total lockdowns or overly broad quarantines. An organization sensitive to the multi-dimensions of health, as proclaimed in its own constitution, would have been more vocal about the reportedly harsh methods of confinement in Wuhan, or the dire impacts of US actions and inactions with respect to Mexican immigrants and guest workers during a pandemic. At the opposite end, the WHO's singular reliance on public health professionals have made it less nimble with respect to reasonable state measures that are not yet backed by rigorous testing or peer-reviewed studies, but which are warranted by the precautionary principle or respond better to localized cultural or political sensitivities. There is very crucially an obvious gap for an organization which was the first to uphold the formal right to health. It has that's what the Constitution proclaims, but the organization has never had anything to say about the meaning of the right to health or its deep connections to other human rights. Something has gone wrong when the world's principal tool for upholding the right to health avoids talking about it. Maybe because public health professionals, like doctors, distrust lawyers, and their talk of legal responsibility for organizational and state acts makes them very nervous. And now, apart from the hazards of expertise, it suffers from the familiar hazards that all bureaucracies have: agency capture, bounded rationality, flattening of diversity, path dependence, ritualized behavior. So if you look at bureaucratic pathologies and deference to funders, these explain some of the small missteps that have undermined the organization's legitimacy. Mindful of China's lack of transparency over SARS, the WHO officials showered China with too much praise, perhaps for just being a bit more cooperative when it came to COVID. Path dependencies help explain why the WHO has been slow to change its course of action or do any of the structural changes that I have been talking about. It has been slow, for example, on the wisdom of travel bans, even when the evidence suggests that the alternative, screening on arrival, is dramatically less effective with respect to asymptomatic COVID than it was with respect to H1N1. So where does that leave us at a time when the two most powerful states in the US and China, use the organization to advance geopolitical agendas that are not always consistent with public health? Well, the famous political scientist Hans Morgenthau said that an international organization is only as powerful as its most powerful member wants it to be. And as I argue in an essay that was published as part of our new USALI perspective series, despite the difference in rhetoric, overt hostility to multilateralism by Trump versus deep apparent solicitude for multilateral cooperation by China's president, both states, in my view, see the choice between unilateral action and genuine multilateral cooperation as a zero-sum game. Neither government supports here or in other places, frankly, in the international regime, as under human rights, supranational efforts to look under the hood at what states are doing. Xi, no more than Trump, wants a genuine independent assessment of who is responsible for the current pandemic and who lied or is lying. Like Trump, he insists that making WHO recommendations enforceable through the Security Council is not a great idea. And Xi's rhetorical commitment to science and fact has given way, for example, if it means having Taiwanese medical professionals involved in the WHO as official observers. So I don't see the current leaders of either the US or China pushing for reforms that would intrude on sovereignty by empowering frontline whistleblowers, by ensuring greater transparency, by enabling criticism of states when they act or they overreact and violate human rights. But I want to end on a hopeful note. I have modest hopes that in a week's time, something might change with respect to one of those actors, the United States. And if that were to happen, I have no doubt that the US would be back to the WHO to push for at least some of these changes. And perhaps my commentator will convince me that I'm wrong when it comes to China. So let me stop there, and I hope to learn from him. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Alvarez, for the very insightful talk about the challenges facing WHO, particularly the challenges from the powerful member states, China and the United States. So I highly recommend to the audience to read Professor Alvarez's paper on WHO in the age of coronavirus, which is on the website of USALI, and also the essay about do Trump and Xi really differ from each other regarding WHO. So here, I guess what I'm going to do is really just to probably to extend a bit the hopeful note, or to speculate what the hopeful note would be. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to do. Firstly, I guess I just want to repeat how important this issue is. I think this is really about the survival of human beings, right? As you probably know, I just got to know a couple of weeks ago from a documentary. Pandemic is actually one of the most likely dangers that could end our civilization. So currently in the wilderness, there are like over 2 million viruses out there, right? And we know only about like 0.1% of that. And so it's really a very big deal. And that tells us how urgent the problem is. And Professor Alvarez has talked about, I think, has covered both the ideals, right? The constitution or the charter of WHO, the holistic approach to health, right? Or the fundamental human rights and connecting to everything. And also the realities of international politics. Here, what I'm trying to do, firstly, I think 2 parts. Firstly, I want to basically try to understand like what's exactly the challenge that we are facing. So this is how I would envision the problem, right? So an infectious disease is found somewhere in a member state, and the virus potentially can end human civilization. ideally, right, international society should obtain the information instantly and start working together to fight the virus. Unfortunately, that's not what's going to happen. At least that's not what happened this time. And facing such an unknown virus, individuals and organizations involved are often slow and hesitant to share the information, or even worse, hiding the information from the outside world due to their concern about political and legal liabilities, right? So, and in the meantime, the virus spreads from one place to another and beyond state boundaries. And from this time on, people and countries start pointing fingers at each other, right? Rather than working with each other, making the whole situation even worse. So this is the scenario. And what I say from this probably very much simplified scenario are two problems. The first one is a problem of information flow, right? The second one is the collective action problem among different entities and different member states in the international society. But these two problems, the information flow, right, problem, and the collective action problem, actually, as Professor Alvarez has said clearly, are common to international organizations. And I would argue actually are common to any organizations in the world, corporations, international organizations, and also nation states, right? So the hope here, right? What we are trying to solve here is really how to overcome those two problems, the information problem and the collective action problem. And unfortunately, the Professor Alvarez has said in his talk and written in his paper, to overcome these two problems, we are facing another level of collective action problem, right? How to get these member states, nation states, to be on board for any reform that Professor Alvarez has been proposing, right? So it's difficult, but I guess the message here from my limited understanding of international law, and maybe also a bit from my understanding about how the Chinese political system works, I think the key message here maybe is just to try to, to seek a consensus among member states and to avoid pointing fingers at each other and focusing on the threat and crisis we are facing. It's very general, but how to do that? I would say we will have to, in a way, to depoliticize WHO, and also to I'm kind of like a legal realist. Well, I think one point probably everybody here would agree with me is that we have to live in the world as it is. And my understanding would be that the current international system is still very much dominated by nation states. I think that would be our starting point, right? And from there, how to get consensus from member states and how to empower WHO. So this is like the baseline I would take, which I view is not very much different from Professor Alvarez. And in the remaining minutes, I'm going to comment specifically on the 5 problems which Professor Alvarez has identified in his paper and also has elaborated and in his talk. The answer here is that I do think in 2 of those areas, there is hope. Even from a Chinese perspective, we might get the Chinese government to be on board for reforms. But there are also like more challenging areas that I think it will be difficult to get the Chinese government on board. Of course, I have no inside information from the Chinese government. So all is based on my really just understanding of how the system works. So the first one, which is very important, is about WHO's inability to overcome its state-centered roots or the over-reliance on member states. I think that the critique is fair, and it's true that Chinese government had really a very I would say, a very rigid idea about sovereignty. I like the words used by Professor Alvarez in his essay, right? The 5 principles is sovereignty times 5. But I think even considering that, I think there are like 2 things which have mentioned by Professor Alvarez that could be pushed forward and China might be on board. First one is about expanding participation of NGOs in international health regime. I think that's actually is possible because if we see the past 4 decades of China, we actually see the rapid growth, the expanding role of NGOs, particularly like environmental NGOs and also public health NGOs. So they have been playing a more and more important role in domestic health regime in China. So I think I don't see any reason why the Chinese government would be against, right, that kind of participation of NGOs in the international health system. We just have to figure out a way to do that. And I would encourage actually WHO to do more, to really to get direct connection with NGOs in China and citizens in China, right? They do deserve a voice. So that's one aspect of this to overcome WHO's like over-reliance on nation states. And second one is really a key here, right? Is about increasing the capacity of WHO to collect and access information directly. That's a key, right? That's going back to our scenario. That's okay. I actually think maybe it's a bit, I'm just trying to push back a bit or to trying to be provocative. I think actually that's likely or that's possible. I actually talked about this in February, late February at NYU in another panel. I said back then, the slow response from the Chinese government actually was due to its own internal political dynamic, particularly the interaction between the central government and the local government, right? And later on in the past months, reports from New York Times and other resources actually have verified this claim, right? It's not that the Chinese central government intentionally hide the information from the international society, right? It was not until like January 23rd, the Chinese central government decided to lock down the entire city. And before that, I think on January the 14th, it had already informed WHO. So it was really its own problem. So therefore, this common information problem, I think the Chinese government, the central government, actually would have incentive to solve this problem. Just for the audience information, the Chinese central government actually after the 2003, the SARS, actually has instituted this top-down surveillance system, which was supposed to connect hospitals directly with the Chinese version of CDC, right? I mean, before this pandemic, they said this system was great and it was going to work, but eventually it didn't work because of the interference from the local governments. So I think it's a common problem, or the WHO or the international society can find a way to basically to assure the Chinese government that this is solely for the purpose of preventing another pandemic. It's solely for the purpose of public health, right? And sharing information. I think the Chinese government would be happy to cooperate to build up such a system in which the WHO could have direct access to hospitals in China. For example, I'm not saying that it's going to be easy, but I'm saying that from the international incentives, I think is possible. So that's the first aspect. The second one, also optimistic, I think, as Professor Alvarez has talked about, is about the inflexible emergency declaration system. I think it's great to have a traffic light system, right? A gradual transition from like less serious to more serious. I think the Chinese government, again, it's possible or it's quite likely that the Chinese government can be on board on this specific reform. And I would even argue that not for anybody's or not for any specific country's benefits, just going back again to my scenario, right? Member states or local governments, they might be slow or hesitant or even hiding information because of their concern about political and legal liabilities. I, again, as kind of a realistic person, I would argue that WHO should actually try a reform that kind of like decouple legal liabilities from the information sharing. Basically to say that as far as the share information, we're not going to hold you responsible based on the information you have shared. So that's of course a slightly different argument. But again, going back to my concern about all the institutional motivations of political entities, right? You have to free them from the fear. Those are the two things I think optimistic, and I have many other things to say, but I think everybody here actually wants to hear from Professor Alvarez. So I'll stop here with just one word. So the proposals, for example, to using more like hard law measures like sanctions, naming and shaming, and also cross-regime collaboration, and also adding lawyers to WHO. Again, I fully agree with all the ideals, but I do have one small reservation, is that would such reforms actually, worsen the collective action problem by adding like a more veto points or more players who have power of veto? So that's like my only reservation. I'm going to stop here, and thank you.
Thanks so much, Shitong. At this point, we already have a couple of questions in the queue, and I think that I want to take the privilege as being a tardy moderator to ask the first one. And my first question is going to be, has international organizations ever worked without a hegemonic player? All the international organizations that were set up after World War II were set up because the United States was essentially a global superpower that had hegemony over most commerce and all organized, coordinated national security response. There's a lot of commentary right now that the United States is and maybe should relinquish this role. Stephen Wertheim has just come forward with a book called is about the advisability of the United States withdrawing from this role. Trump specifically campaigned on the idea that the United States should withdraw from this role. It's an extremely expensive role. And so given that Shitong points out that all organizations, whether a law school faculty, a city, or a international organization, suffers from collective action problems without a central sovereign coordinator, how is it possible for any of the reforms that you mentioned, Jose, to ever take place in an age where we don't have Pax Americana?
So that's why I cited Hans Morgenthau. But remember that Hans Morgenthau was not saying that it requires the unique one superpower. That is, he said, its most powerful member or members. And therefore, the fact that I think we are certainly, if we're not there already, in a state of play where at least we have two superpowers, means then that in order to achieve the kind of reforms that both I and Shitong are talking about, it behooves us to make sure that the two hegemons in that organization can sometimes work together to push for those reforms. So I tend to agree with you, Rick. I think that the reason NATO works or the UN works as well as it did had a lot to do with the US throwing its weight around. And let's face it, without the victors of World War II, we wouldn't even have the Security Council having the powers that it has. And in fact, the whole structure of the UN Security Council is premised on 5 superpowers, quite dated perhaps, but that's the flaw of the charter, that they put them the actual names instead of a criteria that could change who those are. But it's premised on getting those 5 and 4 more votes from the rest to take action. So I agree with you that it takes power, and it would be extremely regrettable if the United States, under, say, a second Trump term, would completely cede that role to China, because I'm not sure that China, left on its own, without pressure from a counterweight, and here I would include not just the US, but Europe, would do the reforms I'm suggesting, because I have not yet seen China support the types of under the hood scrutiny in other regimes that it would take. I think whether or not you go with sanctions or not, I think that's a contentious question, but it takes transparency. And the reason you want those non-state actors, those frontline workers, is precisely to tell us what is actually happening, that either because of bureaucracy or because of lack of political will or because of inept state federal relations, which of course we have in the US as well, just see where we are on COVID. So that's why we want those non-state actors. But Rick is quite right, in my view, that in order to empower those state actors, to have that committee C, for example, embedded in the World Health Organization, you need not just today the support of, say, a future Biden administration, but also probably the support of China and other funders of the World Health Organization. Because with global health, like many global problems, you need every player to work, or at least the important ones. I would say the same thing about climate change, right? I don't think the Paris Agreement, standing on its own, can achieve the goals. But I do think that Obama administration was on the right track to pursue alongside Paris a side agreement with China to enable both of those powers to achieve the climate change goals. And if those two actually did reduce the emissions and go with clean energy, which China is far ahead of us in some respects, and certainly in terms of manufacturing, then I do think that there is hope that others will follow, if nothing else, because of market-driven incentives and global supply chains. So my answer is, Rick, I agree with you, but I think that it doesn't say in a bipolar world it can't happen if the two were to find areas for cooperation. My hope is that we would get away from the current talk of total war between the US and China, the decoupling talk, to realize that this is what Madeleine Albright called statecraft, where you have to be able to confront your adversary on things that are inevitable, but also work with them on things where cooperation is absolutely vital. Global health is one, nuclear proliferation and North Korea is a second, climate change is yet a third, and there may be quite many others. So what I see happening is a more sober approach to what the future of China holds. No talk of regime change, no talk that alongside trade and investment will come democracy, but a more realistic assessment of the areas where we have common interests or can be forced to see them. And I think global health has that potential. So I'm not sure I disagree with anything that Shitong said about the possibilities of reform, but I do think, in my view, that the only way we will get them is if the US is also there pushing for them. The US is the major, or has been, the major financial contributor. My fear, though, is having had this disastrous turn on COVID, that it will take a very long time, if ever, for the United States to restore its credibility, that it is actually capable of doing the things that say a Biden administration would promise. So that unless say we change to a Biden administration and COVID is actually under control in the US itself, we will have no credibility to push for any changes internationally.
Shitong, what do you think? Is it possible to overcome collective action problems absent a sovereign who can enforce the resolution of those problems?
I think it's theoretically speaking is possible, as I think as Jose has indicated. We need to get the incentives of member states right. That means get the incentives of the United States right, and also get the incentives of Chinese government right. So if I understood everybody here correctly, member states always have their own geopolitical agendas. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. for example, as Jose has mentioned, the Paris Agreement, I'm sure the Chinese government signed up for it probably because of some geopolitical agenda. So I think it's the same thing for WHO. How do we find what would motivate the Chinese government to do something, right? To be on board for the reforms. So I think that's okay. And on that, that's why I actually disagree a bit with Professor Alvarez's paper about the name and shaming, and also other sanctions. It's not that I disagree with the effect. How say? It's just from the record, as you have written in your paper, like in South China Sea, and also like the International Criminal Law, Criminal Court. It's just that Chinese are just the same as Americans. It's not just individual leaders even, right? It's kind of this exceptionalism. They are not comfortable with, to a certain degree, surrendering their sovereignty to a international mechanism with the teeth, right? That you have argued. So, yeah, I think it's possible, and the U.S. leadership and also Chinese to be on board are crucially important. So, and as we know, in any system, it's not only the centralized order, there's also a decentralized order based on reputation or other kinds of invisible or visible benefits for individual member states.
That's great. I want to say, on our schedule, we have Q&A portion, but I already have a question in from the chat line, which you're going to read. WHO didn't reform after Ebola. What makes anybody think it will reform after COVID-19? And I guess that question is directed to both of you, but Jose, what do you think about that problem?
So a cynical way of putting it was Ebola affected the wrong states. That is, one of the problems of international organizations is that they tend to respond when they affect the important states, the ones with money, especially the US and Europe. And so one of the other disasters is we have not devoted the resources, the scientific expertise to the types of diseases that actually create the most serious causes of pandemic, diseases that are transmitted, for example, from bats to humans. And why haven't we done that? Well, because it's not a disease that has interested as much the high-profile hospitals and researchers in the West. This is a familiar third world approaches to international law, or TWAIL critique of international organizations. And I think that Ebola just did not, and by the way, all these reforms that I'm suggesting, or most of them, came out from the reports on Ebola. They were ignored because Ebola was controlled in the places that matter. It didn't reach New York, right? Now I think that when you have, and this is a sad fact, that is, and I'm playing on Professor Hill's question, when do you get the hegemonic powers to act? When they are directly impacted. They should have realized that they are directly impacted by any pandemic, and that Ebola, but for a few different circumstances, could easily have gotten not just to New York, but to sacred Austin, Texas. But that's I think the bottom line. I think it was not a priority. The other difference is the sheer scale of the two. That is, we're talking now the most serious pandemic in terms of lives lost, economic catastrophe. There is a looming threat, by the way, depending on how long it lasts, with respect to famines, and famines produce conflict. That's where the peace and security, we have not yet seen that, but I would predict, sadly, that unless it comes under control in a variety of very dire places where conflicts are already looming, we will see internal wars, conflict zones exacerbated by this. And when it reaches that, you can predict some action. Keep in mind that, and this is just in partly a response to Shitong, we have turned, in my view, sometimes quite successfully, to sanctions when the threat is terrorism, for instance, when the threat is a nuclear attack from North Korea, when the threat is even to our elections. We have imposed, even under the Trump administration, sanctions on Russia and others on cyber security. And that's why I do think that there is something positive when the Council on Foreign Relations now, for instance, puts out a full report on how reform of the WHO and pandemics, because of the seriousness of what Shitong has pointed out, is a national security threat as much as terrorism was, nuclear proliferation is, for all the many spillover and other reasons. Once it comes to that level, I do think a lot of things are on the table, including possibly Security Council sanctions to enforce some of these things because of the consequences on peace and security.
Shitong, do you have any? Do you want to add anything to that?
I'll just add quickly. There's something just came into my mind about, like, first, I fully agree with Jose that, if you have the major powers are in trouble, they would have incentives to do something, although we don't know like what exactly the things they are going to do. But this is how it just came to my mind. How I would sell the idea of WHO reform to the Chinese government, right? The US is still in this big trouble of pandemic. So that's a crisis the US is facing. China seems to be doing much better. But China as a member of the international society, as I view it, now is in this big trouble of international diplomacy. Think about it, at the very beginning, I don't know, like in March, the Chinese diplomatic officials probably think that, okay, this is going to be like the big victory for us because we are doing great and we are going to help the rest of the world. And it had done lots of things, for its own considerations. And the thing is that the popularity of China, according to the surveys reported by newspapers, have actually decreased a lot. And what's the problem? We could see that actually it's exactly the problem of information, right? The rest of the members of the international society, right? Regardless of what I have said, the rest of the world thought that the Chinese government has, whether it's the central or the local government, has hide information, had manipulated the information, right? Therefore, it's not credible. So if I was going to do it, right, I hope I could persuade the Chinese government that to increase your credibility in the international society. It's not just about giving things to others, right? Even when you give masks to others, people thought your masks are problematic because you are not credible. Actually, to increase your credibility, to be on board on such reforms would be actually the best idea, right? To become a respectable member. So anyway, just some thoughts.
Sure, I want to follow up on that. That we're right now in the middle of the 5th plenary session of the 18th Communist Party Central Committee. And commentary from abroad is, I think, captured nicely by Julian Gewurtz's piece in Foreign Affairs, which is that the tone is triumphalist, that China's doing great. Now that might be because they believe China's doing great, or it might be because they think in order to signal that China's a successful country, they must say that China's doing great. But that suggests that there's a collective action problem within China as well. It might be that every single member of the Standing Committee of Politburo, for instance, believes, and Xi Jinping believes, that China needs to be more forthcoming. But they also believe that if China's forthcoming, and it's politically embarrassing to China, the value of that won't be very high for China. They also have to believe that if they're forthcoming, other countries will be equally forthcoming. So there's two kinds of collective action problems that go on. One collective action problem is that each player within the Chinese system doesn't want to take the blame for a failure that makes China look bad abroad. So Wuhan political leadership certainly doesn't want to come forward prematurely. It'll make their party secretary look bad. But likewise, within, say, the Central Committee, there's many political actors. Each one, if they come forward with bad news, is likely to be in an embarrassing position. And so it's quite possible that each one will take a triumphalist attitude towards how China is doing, because who wants to be the first one to step forward and say, well, actually, there's this problem that we need to address. So what kind of institutional mechanism can we, if it's true that there's no obvious way that the world can solve collective action problems just by wishing that it were so, how can the Communist Party solve its collective action problems?
Okay, I'll respond, but I think everybody else wants to hear from Jose, so I'll be quick.
No, this is yours. This is all yours.
Yeah, this is mine. Yeah, this is mine. So think about it, right? This is all we have been trying to figure out. Think about the automatic surveillance system put into place by the Chinese CDC after the 2003 SARS, right? That was supposed to be a solution, right? If there's any of such infectious disease, it would like automatically trigger the warning and directly to CDC. Therefore, it's nobody's fault, right? It's just something happened. So that's what I say actually to the WHO, for example, to work directly with either Chinese government or other member states with the advancement of technology nowadays, to institute a system to connect directly hospitals and some kind of centralized information system, like an international platform, right? I just say theoretically that could be a solution. And also, as you have said, everybody wants to appear like political actors, right? To appear to be strong, appear to be like triumphed, right? Nobody wants to report the bad news. What we are trying to do here, this information platform or system or other kinds of reforms, is to see that bad news, news about virus, that's not equal to bad news. That's not equal to bad performance, right? That's why I say we should decouple the information disclosing from any political or legal liability. That's a way to go, but of course, I know it's just much more difficult to do in reality than we are theorizing here. But I think, again, as the Chinese government did try some reform after 2003, and I would speculate that although currently the Chinese government appears to be like, we have done it, all right, we have done it very well. I think the Chinese government, at least one part of the machine, is thinking about how to do, at least to push forward some kind of reforms to the health care system, the hospitals, the information monitoring system, to avoid such a tragedy in the future. So China is complicated anyway. So,
Jose, do you want to add to that?
No, there was one aspect. I don't really know enough about the Chinese internal system to comment on, but it does strike me that Professor Hills has latched on to a real problem, which is it's very hard to convince the plutocrat at the lower level that by telling the truth, they won't be punished, especially if it turns out that there really was something that they could have done to prevent that last outbreak. So that's always an issue. As to the prospect of litigation, here I tend to agree that lawyers tend to reach for adjudication and putting legal accountability in terms of damages for what somebody does way too quickly. They rush to that. There's a lot of talk in the US, mostly by Republicans, I will say, about suing China, perhaps passing an amendment to the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act to enable suits against China to proceed, just like we have with respect to certain acts of terrorism, including Cuba. And that is feasible. I would think it is tremendously unwise to do that. I think it puts us very differently in terms of the traditional notions of what sovereign immunity is. And I think it will come back to haunt us. If it turns out that you open that door and US actions and inactions around the world are the subject of lawsuits, as well as actions of companies in the US for COVID actions. But I will say, on the other hand, the COVID litigation is not something we can control. It is out the door. There is a wave coming of COVID-related cases in national courts. We're starting to see them in Spain, in many places around Europe, directed against governments, for example, not necessarily against China. And there is a wave of COVID-related human rights claims that are going to come up before the European Court of Human Rights, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and those are binding decisions that could have political consequences as well as damages, but also politically salient claims under individual complaint mechanisms under all those human rights treaties. So that, like it or not, a regime that has been resistant to lawyers and that has never had resort to the arbitration that is anticipated in the IHRs. So the IHRs permit arbitration if there's a dispute between states. The WHO Constitution anticipates taking something to the ICJ involving the interpretation. But I don't anticipate it because it has been an organization that resists at all costs going down that route for very good reasons. It tends to go down the route of liability in situations where cause and effect are tremendously difficult. Who is to blame for the so-called Trump virus in the United States? At what point does that chain of causation stop with Trump or goes back to China, etc.? So I think these cases, that the wave of litigation that I'm describing is unstoppable, but I'm not sure where they'll go. But it's not something that we can wholly prevent. I do think that to the extent we can prevent some things, like suing China in U.S. courts idea, we should not go down that route.
We have some more questions coming in. One that just is sort of along the same vein as the question that just came up. Won't plutocrats and bureaucrats, in fact, be punished if they are transparent in China? Recall the female pathologist in China who saw CV-19 in her microscope at the end of December and who tried to warn her colleagues. So I guess that's a version of the same question, which is how do you make a credible commitment to people that if they're transparent and that 100 flowers really will bloom? Or is that simply a way to get suckers to come forward and put
and
themselves—
we know what happens to suckers.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's the same question that you could ask at the international level. Why would China feel it's being a chump if it opens up its system to scrutiny by countries that actually want to unravel that system? So imagine that you're a Leninist and you believe a Leninist system with democratic centralism is a good system. And you also believe that the leading other player is not only interested in solving the COVID pandemic or future pandemics, but also interested in bringing down your regime. Right. Aren't you like the female pathologist, right? Writ large. That is to say, oh, well, they say they want me to be transparent, and they say that if I'm transparent, they won't try to undermine my regime. But I know perfectly well that as soon as I am transparent, they will use that information to make and to embarrass the regime and make us look bad. So, I mean, in some sense, just as China needs to give assurance to its local party secretaries that they'll be rewarded rather than punished for candor, we need to give assurance to China that they'll be rewarded rather than punished for candor. It's a version of the same question, but I guess I want to sharpen it for Jose. Doesn't that mean we need to take issues off the table at the international level?
So
yeah, you know, a potent example would be, doesn't that mean that we need to promise China that issues like, I don't know, ICCPR, human rights, the treatment of Uyghurs, you name it, that will be separated out entirely? That in some sense we will acknowledge their sovereignty over issues that don't directly involve the security of other countries? In other words, does that mean we need to get extra Westphalian to make China and Chinese central leadership be secure? And by Westphalian, I mean, doesn't that mean that we have to accept the very strong view that international human rights aren't really a matter of collective security, that is the business of other nations?
So let me. So one approach that I think we've both suggested is if you elevate pandemics to the level of where you already are getting that level of cooperation. And I'm mentioning terrorism, right? I mean, the excuse for the Uyghurs is, of course, terrorism, right? Because that's the threat. And so China has bought onto this idea that when it comes to accepting intelligence reports about internal threats posed by terrorists, that is something it wants to buy into. It wants to know those internal threats. And so the hope Shitong, I think, especially is opposing, is to convince everyone that that is that kind of threat, that a pandemic is the kind of threat that we want to have the frontline medical expert who knows about it be able to have a direct access. Now, in the West, some of that is happening through media, right? So no matter how many times Trump is on the campaign trail saying, I don't want to hear about COVID, and I think yesterday he suggested talking about COVID should be illegal, that he can't stop that, at least so long as we have the kind of social media, press, and everything else that puts it on the front page every day. In the absence of that kind of freedom, then you need special dispensation of the kind that I think Rick is suggesting for that kind of threat. But I don't think it needs to coast into accepting, and nothing else that is under your hood cannot be scrutinized by committees that are independent. So I don't see a prospect for a deal at the Security Council that says, oh yeah, fine, if you, China, accept scrutiny on COVID and pandemics, we will direct the human rights system not to scrutinize you on all these other things. That's not happening.
Shitong?
Yeah, that's actually the question I have when I was reading Jose's paper. So I think this is really a point here, right? We don't want to go that far to say that, okay, as far as you cooperate on COVID or other kinds of pandemic related matters, we are not going to look into other things. I think is going to be too far. I think what or I would imagine that because this actually is a tension, right, between this proposal and your proposal of like a cross-regime collaboration in international law and organizations. I think Rick's proposal, or what I would propose, is really to kind of like isolate WHO or the pandemic-related matters, because they are really endangering the survival of human civilization, right? To isolate this matter from other kinds of things. It's not like we are still going to look into other matters through the existing international channels, frameworks. But it's just that since information is so important for preventing another pandemic, we are going to isolate information in this part from other parts to make sure that the Chinese government feels that it's just a public health issue. They are not going to try to, change their regime through the information we have provided to them. I guess that's, yeah, I'm just wondering, like, Jose, what do you think about the tension between cross-regime collaboration and the Chinese government's, preference of, focusing on a singular issue?
The risk of calling it a security issue is that then everybody assumes then the Security Council has to take charge. So I think that is a serious problem. And I think the better approach is to say, when it affects peace and security, it is a Security Council issue, but in many circumstances, it's finance issue. And therefore, the World Bank should be at the forefront of providing assistance so that we don't have famine. And the problem that we face now is that we have all of these ripples throughout being caused by the pandemic and no set mechanism to coordinate responses, because the World Health Organization can't say to the the WHO can't say to the World Bank, we need you to do this. And the WHO can't send an Ebola type peacekeeping mission to this particular hotspot in the world that desperately needs it, because it doesn't have that capability. So unless we were to revamp completely the WHO so that it has peacekeeping missions, and nobody's envisioning that, we need some system to permit the collaborative activity that is needed now, right? Because I think what we're seeing are problems that coast across all of these regimes, and not just at the UN system level, regional organizations as well, the G7, the G20, all the other organizations need to be able to have some form of collaborative ventures when it comes to this. If we really want to do something that responds to the world's needs.
We have a question from Eli, which I think is really right in your wheelhouse, Jose. And it is, look, the Convention on the Law of the Sea has been successful, but it is successful despite the hostility of both the superpowers, China and the United States. So does that provide a model of how a coalition of actors, rather than, you know, a single hegemon or single sovereign, semi-sovereign superpower, can enforce international regime? Could the relative success of UNCLOS be considered an example of a global regime that could be maintained by a coalition of states? Or do you want to question the premise?
So, no, I think maintaining a regime that has been encouraged or strongly induced by a hegemonic power is a different question from who started the regime. So I happen to think that UNCLOS has some fragility at the moment because, in fact, the South China Sea disputes are so at its core, and that if it's not handled properly, China's own actions could derail the agreement on not just the rules, which are a pragmatic compromise between the rules of say, states that want their economic zones and territorial seas and the resources there, with great maritime powers that want transit rights above all else. And that's the deal that was struck. What is amazing is that the deal has managed to be struck despite the fact that the US has never ratified the Law of the Sea Convention for its own, because of its own political difficulties. That is, getting something through 2/3 of the Senate is impossible. And I suspect that will not change in the next administration, whoever that is. So that it shows you that once the pragmatic compromise is struck, then it does not necessarily need to be enforced in court. That is, China's not going to the various options for dispute settlement in UNCLOS, but it is respected when everybody thinks that it is getting something out of the deal. And that includes peace and stability by not taking disputes with respect to islands versus rocks and who owns the South China Sea, all the way to the point of breaking the regime. But I'm not sure that that responds to Eli's question. But I do think that in the back of UNCLOS was definitely great power interests. And certainly the US, even though it never ratified it, was pushing for that pragmatic compromise. Okay, states get some access to resources, even in the economic zone, including the deep seabed, which at one point was supposed to be a big deal. You'll also get your continental shelf. No matter how far it goes, you can drill down into that. But let's make sure that our submarines can travel, including in your territorial sea, and let's make sure that that we can transit through all the world's oceans and not have any stopping point. That's our national security, and that's what makes us a great maritime power. So I do think that even UNCLOS reflects hegemonic power.
That's interesting. Now, Catherine asked this question, and I just thought I'd put it out there because it's a really good, general question for a law faculty. What can civil society actors do in the absence of US or China leadership? Universities, law faculties, NGOs, I would throw in there corporations, foundations, some of which are transnational actors, some of which have serious money. So suppose that we had anarchy at the national level for, we could say, internal collective action reasons, that the United States suffers from gridlock. China, in a weird way, suffers from gridlock. That is to say, there's mutual fear about revealing problems to the regime. What can a law faculty do? What would you recommend that we do? Or any academic or any NGO?
You want to go first, Shitong, or?
Up to you. I could go first, but.
So I would say that the WHO right now is already heavily dependent on the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which is the major source of funding. That's been both good and bad. So that if the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation thinks it wants to put its money and encourage the organization on mosquito netting, that's where it goes. If Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation don't want to go on reproductive health, we won't go there. So the World Health Organization does respond to where the money is, and it has shown that way. And also keep in mind that there's a huge area that I know less about of the heavy influence of pharmaceutical companies on not just the World Health Organization, but on Gavi, all these other entities. Right now, thanks to Bill Gates' money, we are those actors, those powerful actors with deep pockets, are basically resisting what I called in my paper vaccine nationalism. They are heavily putting their money on making sure that any vaccine will be available as widely as possible to the places and persons who need it most. Frontline healthcare workers being everybody's favorite first folks. So we already are seeing that. I do think that if you're talking about academics and institutions like USALI, all of us should be heavily invested in reform proposals, because we have seen in the history of international organizations reform proposals that were initially resisted by governments being taken up by civil society. We would not have a landmines convention but for the actions of a bunch of NGOs and Lady Diana at the time. And we wouldn't have a huge number of initiatives that have had, despite a lot of cynicism these days on human rights. Keep in mind that even when a human rights convention does not secure uniform ratification around the world, the idea today that it is legitimate to have a government disappear its political opponents, like Argentina did, is untenable. And that means we have a convention on enforced disappearances. And I do think, despite what I see heavy resistance these days from China, it is very hard to suggest that human rights defenders don't have human rights and are not themselves worthy of protection. But what we see now in human rights entities at the UN, including the Human Rights Council, is a push by China and some of its allies to say that's not the case. It would be nice to protect them, but it is not required by human rights law. So I do think that on all of these issues, there is a push that civil society can make, and it is pushing against very strong political forces. But on occasion, the sheer idea of something has such normative impact, and I do think global health has that it appeals and breaks through and makes it hard for a government, whether it's authoritarian or democratic, to resist the normative appeal. And that, I would say, is today the right to health, which, thanks to Trump, is more popular than ever, even in the United States.
I'm sure, Tom.
Yeah, I would say actually exactly the same thing in the Chinese context. Actually, I think we are all partly, impacted by heavily by what the Chinese government had said about the pandemic, about Wuhan. But from my observation, is actually during, for example, the Wuhan lockdown, civic organizations, corporations have played a huge role during that time. I'll give you just, I think, 3 examples. Right. Firstly, it's about the Red Cross in China, right, which is an official organization, right, which is important during such pandemic or public health crisis, which has lost its credibility entirely due to the past scandals, right? So it didn't really play a big role. Well, there were scandals during this Wuhan lockdown, but instead, like pop stars, right, like Han Hong, the famous female singer, right, she was able to actually got lots of donations from her fans and also just the society, and then get the stuff delivered to Wuhan. And she was just one of them, right? So this is like government, state versus society. And in this case, clearly the society, this like pop stars played a bigger role, an independent role. So that's the first example. The second example, right? You would wonder what's going to happen, right? During a lockdown, who is going to deliver your food? All these kinds of things. The Chinese government would tell you that, oh, all the party members, the government officials have done all the work. I mean, they have done part of the work, but as we know, the delivery platforms, right, the internet giants, actually in this case, they played, I would say, at least an equally important role. The third one, just to kind of do a bit selfish self-promotion, right, is that, for example, at the neighborhood level, we know in this lockdown, right, what really makes this lockdown top-down effective is really the control at the neighborhood level. And we say that also this fight between the neighborhood residents committee, which is like official, is the government, right, versus the homeowners association, which is more autonomous, independent organizations. Actually, the latter, the autonomous organizations, they also get themselves organized and also to deliver the public service needed. So I guess the message here I want to deliver is that even in China, we're talking about the huge shadow of the state. We often ignore the growth, I would say the very remarkable growth of civic organizations and the society. But a slight difference from Jose is that all these organizations, they don't take credit. They don't take credit. So I guess that's a kind of Chinese secret to survival and also to develop. They don't take credit. They don't contest, right, the authority, but they are growing, right? That's a fact we have to take notice. But I do want to ask Jose a question. I want to ask, it's running out of time. You mentioned that law, even in international law particularly, actually is a way of playing a role of regulating member states' behaviors. It's not necessarily through coercion. As you have said, it could be coordination, right? Kind of like a focal point impacting member states' expectations. So that's to say there are like multiple ways that an international organization can play a role. As you have written in your paper, it's not just WHO in crisis, it's an entire liberal international legal order in crisis. I'm just wondering like your broader thoughts about the liberal international legal order, and also like which organization, right, WHO can look into to say, okay, that's actually a relatively successful example that we can draw like inspirations for our reform.
No, and so no, I'm glad you tossed it out, but we are running out of time. So let me just give it 1 minute. I think that Trump and other populists around the world have definitely impacted the whole premise that we can and should have international organizations solve problems. What I think the future holds for, say, a future Biden administration, if we have it, is to convince the US public, at least, that these are what many people call intermestic problems, international problems that have serious domestic ripples. So if you sell the WHO and perhaps enhance powers for them as just a international version of Dr. Fauci, who seems to be quite popular, and that by giving them these select powers in this area, you will make sure that we can open up the United States by following the WHO, which happens to be now about mask wearing and contract tracing and isolation, as opposed to lockdowns. So the WHO, it doesn't generally favor lockdowns. They say, if you do these other things, you won't need these things, which is quite consistent with a politically appealing middle road that I see in US politics. And so the crucial thing is to convince the public that when we empower or when we turn to international organizations and allies, NATO or others, we're doing so with direct beneficial consequences on important problems on Main Street. And therefore, you have to convince people that if Main Street is flooded, burnt to the ground by climate change matters. And the same with a pandemic.
Well, it does look like we're at the end of our time. I want to thank you both so much for a really interesting and important discussion. And I want to remind everybody that next Wednesday, we're going to have another discussion about COVID in the international order, focusing on East Asia. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you, Shitong.
Thank you, Jose. Really learned a lot. Thank you, Rick.
Bye-bye.